Hello, hobby friends. Axolotl Aristotle, a friend of mine, asked me if I could make him a surfboard for a Space Marine captain. Let's get to it. This is actually my captain model, but he is the same one, so I'm using this one as a guide. Now, the feet on this guy aren't exactly level with each other. Since I'm making an edition for a model I don't have, I don't really want to repose mine and then swap captains. I'm going to see what I can do without altering the miniature. I get out a sheet of 1mm plastic card and score a line so I can break off a piece. No need for a panel line scoring tool, the back of a hobby knife with a broken tip works fine. Once the groove is deep enough, I flip the blade around and use the sharp end of the knife to finish it off. I don't recommend doing this for anything thicker than 1mm though. Of course, if you don't have any plastic card, you could use chipboard, 2 layers of cereal box, or even the coveted hobby-grade plastic card. The dream material of all hobbyists. To make the installation of my friend's captain as seamless as possible, I'm going to utilize the pegs coming off of the captain's feet. It looks like the holes in the base that the Mini came with are 2mm wide. Using the Mini as a guide, I roughly mark where to drill the holes and how big I want the board to be. Then I score like before, and break it off by hand this time because I'm impatient. It's a little too long, so I break off another piece. This looks to be about the right size. Then I outline what I think the outline of a surfboard looks like. I suppose I could look up the exact contour shape online, but where's the fun in that? Let's just say it's heroic scale or something. I continue by scoring some more, not to be confused with scoring s'mores, which is what happens when you rob a campsite. I break it off, and now I just need to trim the rounded sections. For this, a pair of old or cheap nippers will do the trick, or in my case, old and cheap. I've been using this pair for about 9 years, and I've seen the same exact pair at Joann for $8, labeled as a tool for cutting off the backs of plastic buttons. To round out these rounded sections, I use a 100 grit nail file, an all-around good tool. I also wipe it on a damp folded paper towel. This removes plastic dust while also moistening the file to enable wet sanding. The contour is looking good. The edges could use some smoother sanding, but I'll save that for later. I remeasure where the holes should be drilled, and drill them. With my drills. This is not a drill. Except for the drill, which is a drill. You know what? Even though the feet are not resting flat on the board, I don't think it's all that noticeable. Now, the back hole is not exactly where I want it to be, so I shift the hole sideways by oscillating the piece along the length of the drill bit while gently pressing downwards. Too much force, and I risk warping or breaking the bit. I do this often enough where I should probably name this technique. I'm thinking drill drifting. Yeah, that sounds cool. And here's me drill drifting at maximum velocity. I've sped up footage in the past, but this is actual speed. Okay, that looks good. Time for a test fit. There we go. That's the stuff. Moving this along, I mark out some places for panel lines. Instead of more scoring and 7 years ago, I'm going to use this sheet of 0.5mm plastic card. I use scissors to cut off a few pieces, and a hobby knife to remove sections from this capital I-shaped piece. It's a little misshapen, but no worries. I can adjust the slight tapering of those troublesome edges by controlled carving. Plastic cement results in a solid bond, but superglue will get me to the cleanup stage much faster. I lightly sand the surface of the board as well as the panel pieces to increase adhesion. Using a wad of sticky tack, I place the glue-buttered panels in place. Aside from the eye shape, the rest of the panels are trimmed after being glued on. I didn't have any leftover pieces large enough to cover the back of the board, so instead of getting out and cutting out more plastic card, I decided to use the existing pieces to make an asymmetrical panel line. Whenever possible, I like to utilize solutions that add more detail with less effort. By the way, does anyone else drill out their superglue bottles, or is that just me? I mean, it works, and the dried glue does chip off the drill bit, eventually. Once all of the panels are fixed in place, I carve away the remaining overhang and sand the edges smooth. I finish off by re-drilling the holes up through the panels. Sweet! Looking more and more like a surfboard. Since this board is designed to be ridden by a Space Marine, it needs a propulsion system. I tried a couple of bits out, but ended up settling on making some from scratch. I started by clipping a section of Gundam runner to length, flattening the end, drilling a hole, and drilling a deeper hole in the 45-degree angled surface on the other end. Then I glued armature wire in to act as a fuel line. While I waited for that to fully dry, I got to work on the supports that will mount the thrusters. I placed the support piece next to the back of the board so I could copy the angle. After cutting along the line, I sanded with a low-grit nail file to adjust the angle as well as scuff up the surface. This connection will be a thin and flimsy one, so it needs all the bonding strength it can get. I glue them into position, and because of how fragile they are at this point, I use my high-quality nice nippers to trim them to length. I prefer to glue something on and trim it later over the more tedious process of measuring it out. The fuel lines seem to be solidified. Good thing it's only a model. Using a mechanical pencil, I bend the wire just shy of a 90-degree angle. I check it against the board, then bend the other end. Then I snip off the excess wire. Oh look, my glue clogged again. Yeah, I should really start putting the caps back on these things when I'm not using them. And look at that, it's dripping all over my fingers. Awesome! Anyway, I get them glued on, and now this Terminator Captain has ketchup and mustard thrusters. With the board done, it's time to make the base. Oh, look at that! I grabbed the right size on my first try. Let's double check. Yep, right size. I poke out the old base, and now I'm ready for basing. Again, I give it a brief sand with 100 grit. Then it's time for my favorite substance, polymer clay. I started with this pearlescent clay at first, but it's too firm, even when compared to my other firm clays. So I kneaded it together with an equal amount of some orange softer clay. Even so, it was still pretty hard to knead, especially since I was kneading a lot of it. One cool thing about the pearlescent clay is that it left behind a bunch of sparkles on my finger. Once I had a big enough blob, I smushed it onto the base, trying for a wave shape. I've never sculpted water before, but it sort of looks like a wave with a surfboard in front. To help anchor the board in place, I added a smaller blob of pure soft clay and blended it into the existing form by smoothing it out with my fingers. Now the board has a little shelf to rest on, making it more structurally stable. I want more of the board visible from the back, so I slice off a huge section of the wave so the front half of the surfboard sticks out into midair. I think this looks more dynamic, and it looks way better from the back now. The next step is to add water texture. I roll a Sharpie over it to create a fluid curve. Then I completed the effect by rolling the back end of my hobby knife at an angle to create wave ridges. The last step of the sculpting process is to remove the clay from the base so it can be baked. Upon retrieval from the oven, I glued it back down onto the base. Then the tedious process of gap-filling the trench formed by the clay in the plastic sandwich. Usually, I make the clay base topper a smidge wider than the base so I can trim away the overhang and leave a nice, flush base rim. Well, I forgot to do that this time, so superglue and baking soda it is. The final step before painting is to seal the clay with a 50-50 mixture of Mod Podge and water. Okay, this base is built and ready for painting. I've got my paint, I've got my brushes, and I've got my wet palette. I'm all good to go. Let's get a proper painting handle. Whoops. This looks big enough. I drop some droplets of black primer onto my palette, followed up with a helping of white craft paint. I mix them together into a gray primer and then slap it everywhere. As cool as it is to surf on an ocean of orange Fanta, I'm pretty sure my friend would prefer realistic water. The primer's all on, and now I just gotta wait for it to dry. Aw yeah, waiting for paint to dry. My favorite part. Uh-oh, there's a stray hair. Probably from the old mop brush I used to apply the sealer. Once I took care of the hair, I gave the affected area a little scrapey scrape, and finished it off with more primer. The primer is dry. Let's get out the colors. Some blue, some yellow, green. That's a little too much green actually. It's only worth a penny, but let's put it back in the bottle anyway. Oh, I just remembered that I wanted to add some superglue and baking soda to the underside of the board for structural reinforcement. It's never too late to add glue. Huh. So that's what happens when you add superglue to wet primer. Well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Pouring on the bee soda, tapping it off, flicking it off. Oops. Man, if there were a miniature painting license, mine would probably be revoked. Okay, primer is actually done. Time for some dry brushing. Craft paint is translucent, so I'm trying for a slap chop approach for the base coat. For this, I mix blue and green craft paint in an uneven ratio with a lot more blue. I don't plan on recreating this exact water effect, so I'm just eyeballing the ratios. Even with the green mixed in, the mixture still looks pretty blue, maybe a bit desaturated. With the base coat applied, you can kind of see the dry brushed highlights poking through, but it's pretty subtle. So I looked up a picture of waves, and it seems that sometimes you can see light through them. To simulate this, I'm building a transition from blue to a greenish hue towards the bottom of the wave. Hopefully, this will appear as light reflecting off the sand beneath the water. I mix white into the greener of the green-blue mixtures I made, resulting in a mint green color, and use that to highlight the lower wave ridges. The paint is covering not quite how I expected it to. I tried to feather out the mint green, and while I'm not great at feathering, I think the nature of the white craft paint is partly to blame for this. Also, it's been a little while since I painted, so that probably also has something to do with it. In any case, I make a kind of mid-tone and use that to bridge the values between the mint and the blue. I'm pretty happy with the result. Of course, I did the same on the front. To inject contrast into the top of the wave, I glaze partially opaque layers of light blue. I forgot to sculpt ridges in the top of the front of the wave, so I highlight imaginary ridges and call it good. It'll end up being in shadow anyway. The board is looking sort of bad. I tried slap chopping it, but craft paint sucks at smooth base coats. Time to break out the miniature paint. Specifically just this one color. One coat and you can see the difference. I like to use craft paint as much as possible, but it just doesn't hold a candle to miniature paint in this kind of application. While I wait for that to dry, I dry brush some white onto the highest points of the wave ridges. I mix white into the blue miniature paint and glaze towards the edges to build a low contrast gradient. Then I mix in more white and get to edge highlighting. This is just my opinion, but I think the first light blue I glazed helps to transition the edge highlights to the deeper blue in the middle. I use the edge highlight color as a glaze to push the gradient at the front end of the board a bit further. Then I reapply the base coat between the edge highlights on the edge of the board. I base coat the areas I want to be metallic with black and follow it up with a zinc metallic paint. It's like a slightly darker silver. The zinc also gets placed in the thruster holes. Yeah, I don't really like how the silver looks on the thruster supports, so I cover it up with a blue base coat. Onto the thrusters, I put down some yellow. Despite it being craft paint, the yellow is nice and bright with only a single coat over the metallic undercoat. The thrust effects each get a red ring, followed by a glaze of yellow to bring it all together. I place a dot of white in the center, and finish it up with a little bit of yellow over the areas where I overstepped with the white. To finish off the wave, I glazed white over the tops of the ridges, and then glazed the same light blue I initially used to soften the transition. This base is just about done. The base rim gets the same blue mixture I used for the base coat of the wave. Now, I think the contrast of the surfboard can be pushed a little further. I take the edge highlight color and mix in even more white, and apply this as a super edge highlight on just the corners. It's a small and quick step, but it gives a huge difference in effect. It's impossible not to see the edge highlights now. There we go, finally done. This base is striking. I wasn't sure that the water effect would look any good, but now I think it's the best base I've ever made, / painted. It looks totally out of place in Warhammer, and I love it. Imagine you're a gene stealer in a Space Hulk, and you turn around to see a Terminator surfing its way through the corridors. Again, the Smurf board was Axolotl Aristotle's idea. He has a Salamander's army, and wanted his HQ surfing on stolen equipment from the Ultramarines. I'm inspired to try out more unusual basing schemes just like this, and I hope you are too. Until next time, have a good one.